Good evening. On behalf of Leeds Civic Trust, welcome to the latest of our series of online events. Tonight's event is Leeds in Sculpture, which is being led by our director, Martin Hamilton. It's a virtual tour around some of the city's statues, sculptures and monuments. The chat function is enabled, so please feel free to post any questions as we go along, any questions or any answers. The talk will last about 45 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes at the end for your questions, which I will start off with Martin. So without further ado, Martin, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you very much for that introduction. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this talk on statues, sculpture and ornamentation, a virtual tour around Leeds City Centre. Before I start the talk, I'm going to actually make give some thank yous at the start, because these things are often forgotten at the end. It wouldn't have been possible to put this talk together without the help and information provided by a number of people. First of all, Hazel Lunn, who is one of our supper walk leaders. This talk was actually originally going to be a supper walk, but of course we were unable to do that. So Hazel had the original idea of a guide around some of the statues, sculptures and ornamentation in Leeds City Centre, and so this is very much based on Hazel's idea. I'd also like to thank a couple of other people who've provided me with information over the last couple of weeks. Michael Meadowcroft has provided some very useful information which I've incorporated into the talk. The Illustrated History of Leeds by Grady and Burt has been a really good reference guide for me in putting together some of the information that you're going to hear later on. The Sculpture Reference Group, the group that is supporting the Council's review of statues in Leeds City Centre, has also been very helpful. Some of the information that they've been putting together has been incorporated into this talk, so thank you to those who've provided that information. And then finally, Linda O'Carroll. Linda is the sort of authority on the Moore Group, and Catherine Moore was involved in plaques that we unveiled a couple of years ago, and some of the information that Linda kindly provided at the time has been incorporated into this talk as well. So those are a few thank yous. I should say I've also sourced quite a few photos from the internet. It's hard to get the photographs in real life at the moment with lockdown. So again, lots of people who've posted photos on the internet over the years will now be recognised in this presentation. Obviously, I can't thank all of those individually. Okay, so I'll make a start. The first thing I want to say is this is the route that we're going to follow. I think you'll have all had this map in the email that you received with the login details. So essentially we start in City Square, we go up Park Row, we go past the Art Gallery and Town Hall, Millennium Square, a little pit stop at the Marion Centre, then back down to the Head Row, down Albion Street and finishing off at Trinity Leeds. So that's the route that we're going to take. But as I say, we will start off in City Square. And the reason we're starting there is partly because I think there's a huge concentration of of statues, sculpture and ornamentation, but also it's very much the entrance, of course, to the city. City Square was really brought about following the designation of Leeds as a city in 1893. It was therefore an obvious name to call it after this new city, City Square. Of course, at the time, and indeed today, many people arrive by train in this location. So it was very much the entrance to the city centre. What they would have seen at the time before the square was created was a bit of a mishmash of buildings and styles, and it wasn't a particularly prepossessing place as an entrance to the city at any rate. So I think what happened in terms of land assembly, pulling together land, selling buildings to make way for the square, purchasing buildings where they were needed, that all happened to enable a square to be established. The building on the left-hand side of the slide, the post office building, of course, is still there. This was, of course, the post office for many years. I don't know if people are aware, but actually the post office never actually owned this building. So whilst it was built as a post office and used as a post office up until, what, 15 years ago, it was never actually owned by the post office, which is quite an interesting fact. So this was, so whilst the city square was proposed by the mayor at the time, it was actually Colonel Walter Harding, a city worthy, who really, it was really the brainchild of this man. He was Lord Mayor of Leeds from 1898 to 1899, and he was inspired by a visit to Italy, where he saw the Italian-style piazzas. And I'll just read a little quote from Harding about his visit to Italy. He said, "I read in a local newspaper that there was a proposal to erect in the middle of it, or underneath it, a lavatory or tramway waiting room, admirable things of the utilitarian kind which appeal so much to the ratepayer. I aroused myself in my leisure in Italy in making a little plan of what I considered might possibly be done with this site. I sent it to my friend, Mr. Bakewell, architect, and asked him to put it into form. Much to my surprise, the corporation did me the great honour of accepting the plan." So that was really the birth of City Square. Now, just a little bit more about Colonel Harding before we move on to some of the objects that we've seen in City Square today. Colonel Harding was very much an international man. He was brought up in Lille in France, educated in a lycée there, and then he went to Leeds Grammar School before completing studies learning German in Dresden. So a man with very much an international outlook, I think. He was a wealthy man. He inherited his father's business, and he manufactured, I guess, what you would call textile paraphernalia, the tools of the trade, the objects that you need to produce textiles at his works, Tower Works, which of course still exists to this day. During his life, he was a volunteer serviceman, rose to the rank of colonel, and used that title really for the rest of his life. He was also a liberal politician, and later a liberal unionist. And interestingly, he represented Headingley Ward, which is the ward that I represented on the council for 12 years. So rather nice to learn that particular fact. I wasn't aware that he represented my old ward. So just to show you a couple of images of City Square through the ages. The previous image was the inauguration of the statues, and that was in 1903. But these images are just some postcards. We have a large collection of postcards at the Civic Trust, and these are some of the different shots that have been taken over the years of City Square. You can see that it's not really a square at all, it's a triangle, and you can see that at various times there's been more road and then less road. The one constant, I guess, has been the Black Prince. That's always been, has always taken centre stage. This is City Square today. I took this photograph a few months ago from the roof of the Majestic, and as you can see, it's probably as big as it's ever been, actually, with the area in front of the post office now fully pedestrianised. And the shape of it, this semicircular shape, is very much going back to the way it was when it was first established. So let's start off then with the most prominent statue on the square, which is the Black Prince, and the sculptor of the Black Prince was Thomas Brock. So the Black Prince, or to give his more official title, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince, lived from 1330 to 1376, the eldest son of Edward III, commander of the English forces during the 100 Years' War. He had a reputation for brutality, but some people nowadays think that was somewhat misplaced. So there was a massacre in Limoges where 3,000 people were killed. But actually research that has taken place more recently has suggested that maybe he wasn't actually responsible for that. So his reputation may be somewhat misplaced. So why is he called the Black Prince? Well, a couple of theories. I mean, this name actually came to a couple of hundred years after he died, so it wasn't contemporaneous with him when he was alive. One theory may well just be that he had a reputation for brutality, hence black. But there's also a theory that it actually referred to the shield that he carried when jousting, which was also black. So we're not quite sure where Black Prince comes from, but there are a couple of theories. Now, you might say, well, why the Black Prince? Why is a Black Prince in City Square? Well, it's certainly true to say that he had no connection whatsoever with Leeds, so it does seem a little bit of a strange choice. But Colonel Harding, who paid for the statue and paid for much of what we see on City Square, he actually believed that he was a fitting expression of chivalry and democracy. And so those two characteristics he felt should be embodied on City Square. They represented the best of Leeds, I guess. And so that was the reason why the Black Prince was chosen. And you'll notice on City Square that, of course, he faces out towards the rest of the city, which I guess is a choice that was made at the time. So there are other sculptures, of course, on City Square, and the first statue that I wanted to talk about was Joseph Priestley. Now, Joseph Priestley, 1733 to 1804, famous figure, of course, famous chemist, born in Birstall, often credited with the discovery of oxygen, although I think one or two other people were also working on that at the time. But certainly, if you're having a gin and tonic whilst listening to this talk, the bubbles that you have in your gin and tonic was something that that Priestley discovered. He discovered carbon dioxide. He was also a founder of the Leeds Library. So an important scientific figure, I think. Now, the sculptor was Alfred Drury. Drury was a key figure in the new sculpture movement. A couple of sculptors in Leeds were representative of that particular category, and these were sculptors who believed in a form that was both naturalistic but also recognisably human. So it combined naturalistic styling with something that is most definitely a human form. Drury was an internationally recognised, or certainly a nationally recognised figure, and indeed, you know, all of the sculptures, all of the statues on City Square were produced by some of the best people at the time. He has work, you can see his work throughout the country, actually. Some of the work on the external, on the outside of the Victoria and Albert Museum is his work. And also, if you go to Vauxhall Bridge in London, there are bronzes representing education, fine art, science, and local government. They are also very prominent examples of his work. And then we move on to John Harrison, one of the city's greatest benefactors, I guess. First Mayor of Leeds, Harrison was known for various endeavours. He established New Briggate, he paid for the replacement of Leeds Grammar School, he endowed almshouses. Possibly the most significant building that still exists in Leeds is St John's Church, which he also established. This particular statue was funded by a councillor Benson and was sculpted by Henry Fair. Now, Henry Fair, again, nationally recognised figure. He specialised in war memorials, which, of course, we have in Leeds, and that's his work, and I'll be talking about that in a little while. But again, decoration on buildings right across the country. If you've stayed in the Russell Hotel in Bloomsbury in London, the Queen's statues on the outside were the work of Henry Fair. So an important figure producing an important figure, I guess you could say. We then move on to James Watt, and James Watt is somewhat controversial because, again, no obvious connection with Leeds, and in fact, he was never intended to be there in the first place. The intention was that Ralph Thoresby would actually have a statue, but the sponsor for this particular statue was Richard Wainwright, and Richard Wainwright was adamant that actually James Watt should be the man that was sculpted and placed on City Square in this location. And his rationale was that that he brought steam-powered engines to the city's mills, and so he was someone that was worthy of recognition. It could have been Smeaton, it could have been other people, but Watt was the chosen one. And I guess this reflects, you know, one rule, I guess, of statues and sculptures, that very often, you know, the design and the subject matter is dictated by the person who's paying for it. And, you know, he who calls the piper calls the tune, I guess. He who pays the piper calls the tune, so that, should I say. And in this case, Watt was the beneficiary of that particular philosophy. And Walter Farquhar Hook, another giant, I guess, in 19th century Leeds, Of course, he was Vicar of Leeds, Vicar of the parish church, now Leeds Minster. He created the building that we see today to cater for what was a burgeoning congregation. But he also created many new Anglican churches, some 21 new Anglican churches in his 22-year tenure as vicar. Established some 30 schools. He also was a bit of a campaigner on working practices. So he was a giant figure in the history of Leeds, and someone that I think was certainly looked upon at the time as a worthy recipient of a statue. And then finally, on City Square, we have Morn and Even, sculpted by Alfred Drury. Now, Morn and Even, these are 8 figures carrying lamps, as you can see there, 4 different poses that are repeated, and these are very much in the Art Nouveau style. And these are the female form representing dawn and dusk, morn and even. Now, the current location of these actually only dates back to 2002, when the configuration of the most recent reconfiguration of Leeds City Square took place. Drury, by the way, was particularly famous for his sculpture of the female form, and I think these are considered to be some of his best works. Now, you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen some balustrades, just right in the bottom corner. Now, these balustrades are the original balustrades, but they were removed, and actually, I believe they were sold. And so when John Thorpe, the Civic architect, looked to reconfigure City Square in 2002, these had to be found, and fortunately they were found and brought back into the city and used again. So yeah, City Square, some wonderful statues, very prominent statues, a real entrance, I think, to the city for people visiting, really from the word go right up until the present day. Another building on City Square, which has both sculpture and ornamentation, is the Majestic. Now, these photographs were all taken very recently, but in fact the Majestic has been there for some 100 years. It was actually built in 1921 to 1922 as a cinema, restaurant and ballroom. Went on to become a bingo hall, of course, in the 70s and 80s. I think I probably went to the nightclub in its final iteration in the 90s. And it was built by Pascal Stellier, who was a specialist cinema architect. It's in the Beaux-Arts style, as you can see. You can see the Greek patterning, the key patterning on the top right-hand corner there. And it's an example of a building that uses marmo. Now, I always like to think of marmo as a very Yorkshire invention, because effectively it's artificial. It's an artificial marble substance. So you can imagine these Yorkshire folks saying, we're not going to pay for marble, we can make something that looks like it. So that was very much what happened on a number of buildings that you see in Leeds from this era. And it was manufactured by the Leeds Fireclay Company in Bermontofts. Now, this building was bought by Rushbond PLC, a local developer, about 10 years ago, I guess. And unfortunately, just after they'd finished restoring it, there was a fire which gutted the inside, and all the original decoration on the inside has completely gone. Fortunately, the outside shell remained intact, albeit that some repairs were needed. You can see on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide the marmo facing in different shades, and the different shades are where they've actually had to manufacture new tiles and put them into place, which is quite a feat, because this is a material that hasn't, I guess, been produced in any great quantity for many decades. And then the other thing, of course, are the statues on the top of the building. So you can see the new statues being winched into place there. And so there are two new statues and 2 new urns. And these are by sculptor Andrew Sinclair. He drew inspiration from the originals, but they aren't copies. And the two statues, the 2 sculptures, represent music and poetry. They were actually delivered 300 miles from his workshop in Devon on a flatbed truck. Now, Andrew Sinclair is a pretty eminent sculptor actually, and you can find his work throughout the country. Probably his most famous recent piece of work was actually a life-size bronze of David Bowie, which you can find in Aylesbury. That was unveiled in 2018. Another building on City Square where we used to be able to find ornamentation is number 1 City Square. This is a building that dates from the 90s and was one of the first buildings that actually moved on from the Leeds look. You may be familiar with the Leeds look, the red brick, slate roofed, stone linteled buildings that were very popular in the I guess the second half of the 80s and into the 90s. In fact, if you look at the image on the right hand side, you can see in the background a building which is very much an example of the Leeds look. Now, this building was decorated with these seagulls. Unfortunately, last year the building came under new ownership, and the new owners decided that these seagulls were passé, and so they were literally sawn off. I walked past and I could see the stump where the seagulls had been attached to the building. We objected strongly to this at the time as a trust, and I think it's a real pity that these have disappeared because they actually brought life to what is actually quite an attractive building, I think. So an example of a modern example from City Square of some sculpture. And then Legs Walking. Legs Walking by Kenneth Armitage, who I'm going to say a bit more about later. This was the unveiling of Legs Walking on a rather blustery day. In the picture, you can see Councillor Judith Blake on the left. You can see the trustee of the Kenneth Armitage Foundation, Anne Elliott, and Civic architect John Thorpe cutting the ribbon there. The item is 3 pairs of legs, which are painted bronze. It was completed, this piece of work, in 2001. Just before Armitage's death, and this is actually on loan to the city. It doesn't belong to the city, but hopefully it'll stay there for some time to come. And then finally, I just wanted to show you a vision of the future. City Square has changed many times over the years. The configuration of the statues, the buildings that we see. It's always been a public square. If anything, it's expanded in size over the years, and there are plans now to largely close the City Square off to through traffic. So in the next couple of years, hopefully we will see an even larger piazza of the style that Harding envisaged when he commissioned the square all those years ago. So quite a bit on City Square because there's an awful lot to say, but now I'm going to move on and we're going to go up Park Row, and we're going to have a look at this particular frieze. This is located at 18 Park Row, formerly known as Abtech House. I actually know this building quite well because my dad had a job when he retired for a short time as a caretaker, and one of his jobs was to lock up some of the offices in the Park Row area. And this was one of the buildings that we used to visit, and I did used to look up at this and think it was fascinating, and what was it actually about. So this was created in 1902 by Joseph Thewlis, who was a local sculptor and stonemason. Minerva, goddess of commerce, is depicted appropriately in the centre. I say appropriately because this was originally a bank. And then the rest of the frieze demonstrates the global reach of the bank, I suppose you could say. So you see various trades, various nationalities depicted. You can see an African man lifting a bale. You can see a Middle Eastern man carrying a basket on his shoulder. I guess you could say that this is probably a reflection of the colonial realities of the country at the turn of the 20th century. This is very much the British, handling the money, doing the paperwork, and then people in the outposts of the empire are actually doing the donkey work, and that's really ultimately is what this actually depicts. So a very interesting piece. And then we're just going to go behind the HSBC building on Park Row into Bond Court, where we find this piece of work. This is a bronze sculpture showing a French boule player being observed by a Yorkshire couple and their small child, probably saying, "Hey, what's going on here? That's not how you play bowls." So obviously it's boule. There's a boule rink just in front, and what's actually happening here is he's playing the game and they're actually waiting to have a go themselves. This was funded by the Scurra Wainwright Trust. The Scurra Wainwright Trust have actually funded a number of works of art in Leeds over the years. And this was unveiled by the Deputy Mayor of Lille, of course, our twin city, in the year 2000. And the artist is Roger Burnett. And Roger Burnett is someone who has produced work in a number of places in the country. He did spend some time in France, so I guess he was a particularly good choice for this particular piece of work. A quick detour to King Street, just behind Bond Court, and looking at Atlas House. Atlas House, another marmo face building dating from 1910, grade 2 listed. Many of the buildings that I'm referring to this evening, of course, are listed buildings. And this was originally insurance offices. And again, no doubt wanting to show their global reach. The stone carvings, which again were provided by Thewlis and Co. Atlas is shown above the door, and then we see representations of different races, different countries above all of the windows. I've honed in on this particular one, which is the representation of an African man, because I think to modernise this would appear something of a caricature, rather crude, even offensive. And I certainly think if this was done today, we wouldn't see an image of this sort. And this is the sort of thing I think that the city is now looking at. How we represent people in our sculpture and what we did in the past, and reflecting on things that perhaps we would have done differently were we to do it today. So that's Atlas House. Okay, we're now moving up to the Head Row and to Victoria Gardens, and here we have a vista where we can see the town hall in the background, the art gallery, the library, the sculpture gallery, and the War Memorial. But I'm going to start off by talking about this particular piece of sculpture. This is known as Reclining Woman Elbow, of course by Henry Moore, and of course the reclining figure was very much his stock in trade. This was produced in 1981, unveiled in 1982 at the opening of the gallery sculpture section, and has very much been a fixture in that location for the last 40 years, I guess. Of course, if you want to see more of Henry Moore's work, you can go in the gallery. Now, Moore, along with Barbara Hepworth, and some would say also Kenneth Armitage, is one of the three really internationally significant sculptors that this region, if you like, has produced in the 20th century. He was born in Castleford in 1898. Trained at Leeds School of Art, now of course Leeds Arts University. Then he moved on to the Royal College of Art, and he actually settled in Hertfordshire. So he was based in the south, and he had his workshop in Hertfordshire. Now he was very much a celebrity sculptor of his day. So certainly post-war, from the 50s onwards, his work was celebrated, and he was celebrated as an internationally renowned sculptor. And with that goes large checkbooks and large checks, because of course his work now commands extremely high prices. So I had a look on the internet, and there was an example of a piece of work produced in that was sold in 2012. It was actually some of his work that he did in the 50s, a figure called Reclining Figure Festival, and that was sold for nearly £20 million at Christie's in 2012. So his work commands extremely high prices, and of course some of these have actually been stolen over the years. Even items as big as this that have just been lifted at the dead of night and taken away. So a really important figure in 20th century sculpture, and there's plenty more you can read about his work online. Say you can go and see some of his work in the gallery and in the Henry Moore Foundation, of course. Moving on then to the War Memorial. I've mentioned Henry Fair already. So here we see the War Memorial. It's on a Portland stone mounting. We see George and the Dragon. We see a winged angel. We see the owls, the symbol of Leeds, which we see, of course, right throughout the city. And we see the Dove of Peace. Now, this War Memorial, of course, is a memorial for both World Wars, World War I and World War II. It was actually originally located on City Square, another item on City Square, but it was moved in 1937. So a very prominent war memorial, and obviously still very much a focus for commemorations on Remembrance Day and other days right up to the present day. And then finally on Victoria Gardens, I wanted to say a little bit about the Town Hall. So Leeds Town Hall, arguably Cuthbert Broderick's greatest creation, although some may argue that the Corn Exchange is certainly on a par. And it really is a symbol, of course, of Victorian ambition, the ambition of the Victorian fathers, as the city was, I guess, gearing up later to become a city. It was a town at that stage, which is why it's called Town Hall, of course. It was completed between 1853 and 1858. Went three times over budget. I mean, it was absolutely bonkers. The dome was added at a later stage because other places were doing domes, and so we should have one as well. But in terms of this talk tonight, I wanted to focus on the ornamentation which we see on the Town Hall, which I think is absolutely spectacular. Now, a lot of this work was done by the Moore Group, and most likely the majority of the decoration was actually done by Catherine Moore, including, and we can see this on the right-hand side of this slide, a portrait of her husband, Robert Moore. I'm going to say a bit more about Catherine Moore and the Moore Group a little bit later in the talk. On the top left-hand corner of the slide, we can see the work of John Thomas, a significant figure, a really significant sculptor of his time. So his work is featured on Buckingham Palace, it's featured in the Palace of Westminster, so a really important person. So they got the best people to do this work, there's absolutely no doubt. Known as Leeds, patronising the arts and encouraging the scientists. The central figure is Athena. We also see owls, of course. We must have owls. And then we also have from the left representations of industry, poetry and music, fine arts, and then science. Science is represented with a figure with a compass, globe, and tools. So really quite a spectacular piece of work. And then you can't talk about the Town Hall without talking about the Town Hall's lions. There are 4 of them, of course, 2 at the front and 2 at the side. And this was where Michael Meadowcroft set a few hairs running for me, because it's generally considered that this was the work of William Day Keyworth. He's credited with this work. These lions were actually installed 7 years after the Town Hall opened. But research and certainly hearsay evidence suggests that actually the work may be that of John Thropp, another Leeds-based sculptor. John Thropp, whose work can still be found across the city. Probably most famously, his work adorned the commercial buildings. If you listen to Kevin Grady's lecture a couple of weeks ago about the commercial buildings, you'll have heard about that building, and his work decorated that building. But the family insist, you know, that this is a rumor that has passed through generations, that he actually was the person that did the lions. So I guess we'll never prove that for sure, but whatever we think about who did them, I think there's no doubt that these are spectacular, and they really do provide a wonderful entrance to the Town Hall. Looking a little bit tired, looking a little bit moth-eaten these days, but still proud, I think, and wonderful to look at. Okay, so we're going to move away from the Town Hall. We're now moving up to Millennium Square, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Kenneth Armitage. So if you look at the image on the right-hand side, you see Nelson Mandela with his arms aloft. I like to think of this pose as the Tommy Cooper pose. You know, they're just like that pose. And this was a pose that you often saw at Mandela, probably telling people to stop clapping and listen to what he had to say. Now, I could say that Kenneth Armitage was approached to replicate this particular gesture, and the work was done, and then it was unveiled, and they said, "Oh, for goodness sake, Kenneth, you've got the hands the wrong way around. They should be downwards, not upwards." However, that would be untrue. That's just made up for a bit of fun. Actually, both arms were already in miniature form in his studio. This is some work that he created some years previously. And so when John Thorpe and councillors at the time, when Leeds was looking to create a new square for the Millennium, when it was considered that Kenneth Armitage, the son of Leeds, should be approached, it was great that he actually had something that very much symbolised the hope and peace that would be appropriate for Mandela Gardens and for Nelson Mandela himself to unveil. We see Robert Hiscox there on the occasion of the unveiling of a blue plaque for Kenneth Armitage. There's a nice story that John Thorpe told me about how Kenneth Armitage was paid. So when it was agreed how much the bill would be, the council said, how do you want to be paid? And he said, well, if you just transfer the money to my bank account, it's the Leeds and Holbeck Building Society, Kensington High Street branch. So although Armitage had long since left Leeds, he still maintained that one link at any rate. Who knows, it may have been a savings account that he started as a boy. But it's a nice story, isn't it, about how Armitage kept his links with the city. So he was born in Roundhay in 1916. He won a scholarship to the Leeds College of Art, another Leeds College of Art person, then to the Slade School. Then he had a Gregory Fellowship back up to Leeds University for a couple of years. His work was influenced very much by his time in Salisbury. So he worked at the Bath Academy of Art for a decade, 1946 to 1956, and the Neolithic landscape of the Salisbury Plains very much influenced the style of sculpture that he did. Now, he really came to prominence in 1952 at the Venice Biennale, where he won a prize for the best British sculptor under the age of 45. And at that point, his star really rose. So he was internationally known. He exhibited in New York, in London several times, and it really was his golden era, the 1950s. He then shifted to produce different forms. And I can show you a slide here showing some of the other work that he did. It's probably fair to say that his star waned somewhat in the intervening period. But then on the occasion of his 80th birthday, there was an exhibition at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. He was given honorary membership of the Royal Academy. And I think towards the end of his life, he was probably given the recognition that he once had and perhaps had lost. And that very much returned to him. So Kenneth Armitage, a Leeds son, and thankfully we've now got a couple of pieces of his work on display in the city centre. Just a little trip up to the Marion Centre and a trip to see Androgyny. Androgyny is an interesting piece, I think you will agree. It's by a man called Glenn Hellman. It dates from 1965. Often mistaken as an object made of fiberglass, but Glenn Hellman himself has confirmed that no, it's actually made of aluminium, and it's the weathering that has given it this colour. And really, this was commissioned by Arnold Ziff, chairman of Town Centre Securities, founder, of course, of the Marion Centre, and it took pride of place near one of his shoe shops, the Stylo Barrett chain of shoe shops. But was later moved to this location, which is near to the underpass. That old underpass, of course, has now been filled in, and so at the moment, Androgyny is in storage, awaiting relocation. And I think we all very much hope that it will be relocated before too long. The word, by the way, androgyny, comes from the Greek word andros, which refers to the combination of both masculine and feminine characteristics. Okay, moving on then, back down to the hedgerow and back to Dortmund Square and the Dortmund Square drayman, a very famous figure, a very familiar figure, the man with the barrel, the beer barrel there. The sculptor is Arthur Schulze Engels, a man who did a lot of work in Dortmund. It's actually a replica of a piece of work that is located in Dortmund. This has quite a resonance for me because I actually took part in a student exchange with Dortmund. Of course, Dortmund is one of our twin cities, and I was there when I was 18. The night before my 18th birthday, a few of the people on the trip got a bit drunk. I wasn't one of them, but a few people got a bit drunk and the school teachers weren't happy at all. So alcohol was banned the next day. So for my 18th birthday, I had to celebrate it with a glass of Coca-Cola. So I will always remember Dortmund. I will always remember that story whenever I walk past Dortmund Square. So we got the drayman, and what did we give Dortmund? We gave them a Redophone box. This isn't the Redophone box. I couldn't find a picture of the Redophone box, but I'll leave you to decide if that was a fair swap. I'm not entirely convinced that it was. Okay, moving on then, looking down the Hedgerow and down Eastgate, the bottom, the location of the old petrol station, the rotunda at the bottom there, we see this statue, this sculpture of Arthur Aaron. Arthur Aaron was a World War II airman, of course, and the only Leeds person to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Now, many people assume that this is a commemoration, it's a commemorative piece of work, but actually it was intended to be a celebration. It was commissioned again by the Scurra Wainwright Trust for the Millennium, and the idea was that it should celebrate an important Leeds figure. So a competition was run, the Yorkshire Evening Post ran the competition, and Leeds Civic Trust supported it at the time. Arthur Aaron was the winner. It could have been someone else who, I won't mention the name, but I think there was another person that was suggested who came quite high up on the list, and I think we're all thankful that that individual didn't get the nod. But Arthur Aaron is the figure in this picture, and we can see him here dressed as a pilot, and he's standing next to a tree, which is being climbed by children. The children represent the passage of time from 1950 to the year 2000. And one of the boys, you will notice at the bottom, has planks attached to his arms to help him fly. And we actually have the maquette of this at Leeds Civic Trust, and I'll just show you this. There we go. So that's the actual, that's a little model of the item that you see at the bottom of the sculpture. Rather nice, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so Graham Ibison, contemporary sculptor, done lots of work. What's he most famous for? I guess that's what he's most famous for. I need to put the name up. Eric Morecambe in familiar pose as people look out to the across the seafront. Okay, we're nearing the end of the talk, so just a couple more to talk about. And I mentioned Catherine Moore and the Moore Group. The names keep cropping up, and really they were prolific and highly successful stone carvers throughout the Victorian era, and they worked with some of the most significant architects of the age. Broderick, I mentioned, Corson, Ambler, all the famous Victorian architects used their expertise and their artistry, and they really did work in Leeds, in Yorkshire, and indeed beyond. We awarded a couple of blue plaques actually for their work, one for Catherine Moore and one for the Moore Group. But this particular one was for Catherine Moore. So Catherine was responsible for much of the work. You can see here a self-portrait of Catherine Moore. We don't have photos or paintings of Catherine, but we do know what she looked like from this self-portrait. You can see examples of her work throughout the city, and you can see the artistry, the detail that she applied to the work that she did. Now, the amazing thing about Catherine was that, and she lived from 1803 to 1877, not only was she a female sculptor, which I guess was extremely rare in those days, and these are sculptors who, they would block out the work, it would then be winched into place, and they would actually have to get onto the buildings to finish off the work. So she'd be seen climbing up these buildings to do the work. She was not only an important sculptor in her own right, but she also actually ran the stone yard in Great George Street following the death of her husband. So she was a successful businesswoman, if you like, as well as being an incredibly successful sculptor. So the Moore Group, this is the Starbucks building on Albion Street, where we have the blue plaque for Catherine. She specialised in people's faces in particular, and particularly in the men's spaces, they often had large moustaches. They often had big mouths. And in fact, I could have shown you yet another building on City Square. And you know, where you will find Mill Hill Chapel, where you will find a gargoyle, which apparently is a gargoyle of her husband, and water comes spouting out of his mouth into the drain pipes. So that's a bit of a revenge if she wasn't very happy with him, I guess. So the Mall Group as a whole was a collection of, I guess, about half a dozen sculptors, many of them related, responsible for many other buildings in Leeds. This is Moreland House on Albion Place that Catherine worked on, but here we see another building of theirs, which is 30 Park Place, now known as the Chambers. This is by the way, the award of the blue plaques. We see sculptors Jill McKnight and Pippa Hale. We see the recipient of the plaque on Park Place, Christine Boothroyd and Linda O'Carroll, who I thanked at the start of the talk. I guess one of the most eye-catching pieces of work that they carried out, and it was actually Ingle who did this work, I believe, is Trent Bridge, which we can see at the bottom of the slide there. Okay, moving on then to Trinity, the Trinity Centre. A couple of works here to talk about. We see here a couple of sculptures by the sculptor Andy Scott. Now, Andy Scott is a Scottish sculptor, and I'll show you a couple of examples of his work from Scotland. But here we see Minerva on Briggate outside of the centre, and then this large horse, Equus Altus, a pack horse, appropriately for Leeds, and not far, of course, from the Pack Horse pub on one of the yards in Briggate. I actually saw the horse being winched into place when it arrived, and that was quite something, actually. Really interesting to watch how that sort of installation works. As I say, better known in his native Scotland, perhaps, and these are some examples of the work that he's done. Some very big horses, a deer here, and this is in the centre a sculpture of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Then inside the centre we also find owls, and these little owls are perched on ledges. They were created by sculptor Antonius Stowe, and of course the owl is a symbol of Leeds, as we all know. Many other owls decorate buildings in Leeds. We can see these owls on the bottom left-hand side near the library, on the library railings. Leeds Civic Trust has a stained glass window. If you want to know about owls, the best place to go is to look at Leeds Owl Trail, and the web address is at the bottom there. Okay, well, the final slide, or the final couple of slides, talk about the future, and I thought it was important to talk about the future. Now, you will have noticed throughout this talk that it has been very much male-dominated. Where are the women, you may well ask? Where are the women? The women are either reclining or they're scantily clad carrying lamps, but we don't really have anything that represents real people who actually existed. We have plenty of men, but we don't have any women. So the ribbons sculpture is really intended to address this issue, and Pippa Hale, a local sculptor, won the commission for this particular piece of work, which hasn't yet been installed. Hopefully will be installed next year. This is what it will look like. It'll be on Quarry Hill in between the college building and the playhouse, it'll be a fantastic piece of work. And on the ribbons will be the names of hundreds of women, people that are famous, people that are not famous, people that should be famous, should be remembered and recognised but haven't been recognised, but all women, and going right back through the centuries to the present day, so living people as well. Why ribbons? Well, ribbons, of course, I guess reflect to an extent the textile heritage of the city of Leeds, but also the ribbons have been used in the past as symbols, most notably by the suffragettes. So a very good choice, I think, for this particular piece of work. So that concludes my talk, but I just wanted to finish off by mentioning that the council, and I think I alluded to this, is currently reviewing the statues in the city centre, and it's important that people have their say on what we currently have what we might have. So this review closes at the end of the week. Please make your views known by visiting this website. I'll include this when we email around everyone with a video of this talk, so you can click on it and fill in the review. But it's important that we have our say on the current stock, if you like, of statues, but also what we'd like to see in the future. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found that interesting, and I'm happy to take any questions. And I think Jane will now rejoin us in video and verbal form. And thank you.
Okay, thank you, Martin. The one question that I have is from Garance, who asks about how we interact with our public sculpture. And she gives the example of the sculptures in City Square that were dressed in Tour de France jumpers. And should that be considered sacrilege or a bit of interactive fun? How sensitive should we be about interaction with our statues?
Well, of course, we have the Duke of Wellington, don't we, on Woodhouse Moor with his red boots, and they've been red boots for as long as anyone can remember. You know, sort of generations of students have touched up the paint on those boots, and actually now a lot of people would think that that was always the intention. My own personal view is that I think as long as we don't necessarily damage these works of art, a bit of fun isn't necessarily a bad thing. It shows actually that people are interested. It shows that people have noticed them. And that people are interested. So I think putting jumpers on these sculptures during the Tour de France, during the Tour de Yorkshire, you know, people have their photographs taken next to them. Why not put some jumpers on? I don't personally see that as a problem. I guess a war memorial would be different. I think you want to respect a war memorial, but I don't see any problem personally with having a bit of fun, as long as it doesn't cause any lasting damage, I guess.
Yes, I agree. And V. Kyle has referred to the future sculpture ribbons and saying this won't address the gender imbalance. What is happening to pre-existing statues? I suppose that the answer to that is that we're having this survey has been carried out.
I think with ribbons, you know, this isn't a statue of a person. So we could have had, you know, Leonora Cohen, for example, the suffragette, who we have a blue plaque for, of course. We have a number of blue plaques for women. We could have had Beryl Burton, the cyclist. But I think the view was that the ribbons statue should be representative of women more generally. And so by creating a sculpture that isn't a physical human form, but then naming people, naming women who've influenced the city in big ways, in small ways, in all sorts of ways, is the start of addressing this imbalance. And I guess what can then happen is we can take some of the names that feature on those ribbons and start to produce those in physical form. So I think the ribbon is a good starting point. What are we doing to redress the balance more generally? Well, as you say, Jane, the council is currently reviewing the statues, and it is, you know, pretty much statues, not sculpture more generally. And I think part of that review is actually asking people to come up with suggestions. Now, then we have the issue of funding, and as I said at the start of the talk, you know, very often the people who pay for these things kind of determine what you end up with. And so, you know, there is an issue of funding, and there always will be an issue of funding. But I think it's an opportunity, yes, to look at what we currently have, and maybe to say, are we telling the stories? Are we interpreting them correctly? Is there information that we would now wish to provide about some of these figures that perhaps we don't appreciate? It's not necessarily about taking statues down, but it's about understanding what they actually stand for and what they mean. But also, you know, are there individuals who should be represented who simply aren't? And maybe people want to use the chat function now to, if they've got a woman who they feel should be immortalized in that way, it might be quite interesting to see what people think. But I think that's the sort of spirit in which this review is being undertaken.
Thank you. I've also got a question that might be difficult for you from Karen Lynch, What is the earliest statue in Leeds?
The earliest statue in Leeds? That's a very good question, and I don't actually know the answer, but I know there are quite a few people listening in this evening that may know the answer to that. I mean, I guess a lot of the work that we have is it depends what you mean by statues, and it depends what you mean by sculpture. I mean, I guess ornamentation. If we take ornamentation, then we can look at some of the earliest buildings, and we can identify designs that were used at the time. You know, and so they would go back to the 17th century, you know, looking at buildings like, you know, the first Wyckoff Hall even, and some of the keystones and the coins and things like that. Probably stretching a point to call those ornamentation. If we're talking about statues and sculpture, then I guess the bulk of what we have in Leeds dates really from the 19th century. I don't think we have much that dates from before then.
Thank you. I think there's a statue of Queen Anne in the library, in the
Yes.
art gallery that used to be displayed in Leeds. I don't know if that was Victorian or if it was actually done to celebrate Queen Anne during her lifetime. That could be.
I think, yeah, and I think that there probably, I mean, there are definitely works of art, statues, sculpture in the museum, for example, that come from earlier times that are no longer outside probably for obvious reasons, but you know, are kept indoors. So yes, I'm sure there will be examples from earlier times, you know, preserved in our museums and galleries.
Right. Thank you. V. Kyle said again about statues on public display and how they're paid for. How about, could town planning step in with regard to statues?
Yes, for sure. I mean, no doubt about it. You know, certainly there's an opportunity through planning gain, through the contributions that developers have to make in you know, providing public realm, for example, and part of that money could be spent on public art. A certain amount of that happens already, of course, and some developers are very good at doing that and do it without prompting. Others, I guess, need a bit more of a shove, and so yes, I think that's something that maybe could be written into the planning guidance that the council issues, or even to make it more of a requirement that some form of public art is required for buildings of a certain size, for example. So yeah, I think that's one way of funding an expansion in the art that we have.
Thank you. I think that's it on the questions for the moment.
That's okay, thank you. Well, if there's nothing else, then it just really remains for me to thank everyone for joining me this evening, and thank you, Jane, for fielding the questions and doing the introductions. I hope you found this talk informative. And just to say, we have a talk coming up next week on Burton's, on Montague Burton, the famous Leeds tailor. That's same time next Wednesday. So when I send an email around to everyone with a link to the video of this, if you want to watch this again, I'll provide a link to the Eventbrite page, and you can register that if you haven't already done so. But I hope you found that interesting. And really, all I'd like to say is have a nice evening. And next time you're in Leeds, it's been difficult, I know, with lockdown. Look at the statues, look at the sculpture, but also look up, because there's an awful lot that you can see above the eye line that is really interesting, and actually really is just as important as these big figures that we see on City Square. So look across, but also look up would be my advice. So thank you very much, and good evening. Thank you. Thanks, Jane.
Okay.